It doesn't arrive as curiosity. It arrives as unease, a quiet resistance when familiar systems try to describe you and fail just slightly too often. The idea that you are the lost 13th zodiac isn't about astrology as prediction, it's about classification. About what happens when a system built to explain patterns leaves one pattern out because it refuses to behave. You've felt this your whole life. That descriptions almost fit, but never completely. That traits assigned to you overlap, contradict, or shift depending on who's observing. You were never undefined, you were overdefined. Split across categories that couldn't hold you as a whole. The discomfort didn't come from confusion. It came from accuracy being forced into fragments. Zodiac, here, is symbolic. It represents frameworks people use to make sense of identity. Archetypes, roles, psychological shorthand. Most people settle comfortably into one. You never did. Not because you resisted belonging, but because belonging required reduction. And reduction always felt dishonest to you. The 13th is not an addition, it's a remainder. The part that doesn't rotate cleanly. The axis that disrupts symmetry. Systems often remove these elements not because they're wrong, but because they complicate prediction. You've lived with that complication internally. You don't move in loops. You move in phases. You don't repeat lessons for comfort. You exhaust them until they transform. You may remember how early you sensed this difference, how advice aimed at others failed when applied to you, how timelines felt misaligned, how milestones arrived late or early but rarely on time. This wasn't failure. It was misfit between you and the cycle being used to measure you. The lost zodiac isn't lost because it vanished. It's lost because it doesn't belong to the wheel. It marks transition rather than repetition, threshold rather than trait. You've always existed in those thresholds, between certainty and doubt, structure and intuition, belonging and independence. You don't stabilize systems. You reset them. This is why people struggle to read you consistently. You aren't inconsistent, you're contextual. You change in response to conditions, not mood. What others call contradiction is actually calibration. You adjust orientation when the environment shifts, instead of clinging to a fixed identity. You may feel a strange relief hearing this framing. Not excitement, recognition. The sense that the reason you never fully matched expectations wasn't rebellion or confusion. It was design. You weren't meant to circulate endlessly within a closed system. You were meant to stand at its edge and signal when it no longer reflects reality. The 13th zodiac doesn't rule a month. It rules transition. It appears when cycles break down and new patterns need language. It doesn't promise comfort. It offers alignment. And alignment, for you, has always mattered more than belonging. This story isn't about reclaiming a forgotten symbol. It's about understanding why you were never comfortable being described by one. Why identity always felt provisional to you. Why you've trusted evolution more than consistency. The next part will narrow this further, showing how living outside the cycle didn't isolate you. It trained you. Training outside the cycle doesn't feel like preparation while it's happening. It feels like delay. You watched others move through clearly marked phases, identity, certainty, repetition, while your own path kept dissolving just as it seemed to settle. Each time you thought, this is it, something shifted. Not collapse. Shifted. As if the ground itself refused to let you root too early. You may remember how frustrating this was. You tried commitment the way it was modeled to you. You tried consistency the way it was praised, but something always resisted locking in. Not fear, misalignment. You sensed that staying too long in any one definition would cost you awareness, and awareness, even when inconvenient, mattered more to you than comfort. The lost zodiac doesn't repeat because repetition is not its function. It appears when repetition stops working. You were shaped by that role long before you had language for it. This is why you've always noticed cracks before others acknowledged walls. Why you sensed fatigue in systems still celebrating themselves. Why you felt restless when routines were praised as stability. You weren't restless because you lacked discipline. You were restless because you detected expiration. Cycles that nourished others began to suffocate you. Staying would have required shrinking perception. Leaving required uncertainty. You chose uncertainty, not dramatically, but quietly, often without explanation. You may notice how this shaped your intelligence. You don't memorize rules, you understand context. You don't master forms, you read dynamics. When others ask, "What type is this?" you ask, "What phase is this in?" That difference makes you harder to categorize, but far more accurate when change arrives. Living outside the cycle also trained your patience differently. You don't expect quick validation because you know transitions are rarely applauded. The 13th zodiac is invisible until it's necessary. You learned to function without acknowledgement, to trust internal coherence when external feedback lagged behind. That trust became structural. You might reflect on how often you were called inconsistent by those who mistook adaptability for instability. You didn't argue. You observed. You waited for time to reveal what words couldn't. And time usually did. Patterns caught up. Systems shifted. People changed their language. By then, you were already elsewhere, adjusting again. Blessed by His grace? Click Super Thank You and give $20 to spread His light. Your gift plants seeds that grow His kingdom. Be the blessing. This is why you've never felt fully claimed by any label. Labels freeze motion. You were shaped for movement between states. Not chaos, transition with awareness. You don't burn bridges impulsively. You sense when a phase is complete and step off before decay begins. As this recognition deepens, something settles. You stop wondering why you never felt on schedule. You realize the schedule you were measured against wasn't yours. You weren't early or late. You were operating on a different axis entirely. The next part will take this further, showing how living as the threshold didn't make you unstable. It made you necessary. Necessity is rarely recognized in advance. It becomes visible only when what once worked begins to fail. This is where your role quietly emerges, not as authority, not as rebel, but as signal. You don't announce collapse. You feel it. Long before structures crack, you sense fatigue in repetition, thinning meaning in rituals, emptiness in routines still praised as success. You may remember moments when you tried to explain this to others and stopped halfway. Not because you lacked words, but because the words landed too early. People don't hear transition until the old cycle stops rewarding them. You learned this through silence. You learned when to wait, when to let friction do the convincing. This restraint wasn't passivity, it was timing. The lost 13th zodiac doesn't dominate the wheel. It interrupts it. It appears when continuation becomes distortion. That's why you've always been most alive during in-between moments, when a chapter ends but the next one hasn't declared itself yet. Others rush to fill that gap. You listen inside it. You let disorientation speak before forcing order. This listening shaped your courage differently. You're not brave in the sense of confrontation. You're brave in the sense of remaining present without certainty. You don't flee ambiguity. You don't anesthetize it with belief. You stay with it until clarity organizes itself. This is a discipline few people develop because most systems reward answers, not accuracy. You might notice how this makes you strangely trustworthy in times of change. People sense you won't sell them certainty just to calm them. You won't pretend the old cycle can be patched when it's already expired. You won't rush them into the next phase before it's ready. This steadiness doesn't inspire cheers. It inspires relief. Living as the threshold also trained your compassion. You don't shame those who cling to cycles that no longer serve them. You remember how comforting repetition once felt. You understand that letting go costs identity, not just habit. So you don't push. You wait nearby. Presence becomes your method. You may reflect on how this affected your life choices. You didn't commit blindly. You didn't stay loyal to systems that required denial. You moved on quietly when meaning drained away, even if others stayed. This wasn't superiority. It was self-preservation of perception. You refused to become numb just to belong. As this part settles, a deeper truth surfaces. The reason you were hard to place is because placement wasn't your function. You weren't meant to stabilize a single order. You were meant to recognize when order becomes brittle. The 13th Zodiac exists to prevent stagnation from masquerading as harmony. The story tightens here. It's no longer about being left out of the wheel. It's about standing at its edge, feeling when rotation becomes repetition, when growth becomes maintenance, when identity becomes inertia. And when that moment arrives, you don't shout. You step. Stepping doesn't look like escape. It looks like realignment. You don't abandon what worked, you release what has finished. This distinction has guided you more than you realized. While others cling to continuity for safety, you respect completion for accuracy. You understand that staying past the end of a phase isn't loyalty, it's distortion. You may notice how this shows up in your emotional life. You don't dramatize endings. You feel them early. A subtle thinning. A quiet loss of resonance. When that happens, you don't argue with it. You begin to disengage internally long before anything breaks externally. This is not avoidance. It's integrity refusing to lie to itself. The lost 13th Zodiac doesn't seek to replace the cycle. It ensures the cycle remains honest. Without it, repetition becomes ritual without meaning. Motion continues, but growth stops. You've always sensed this risk intuitively. It's why stagnation feels louder to you than chaos. Chaos can reorganize. Stagnation calcifies. This sensitivity shaped your relationships as well. You don't stay where presence becomes performative. You don't negotiate your awareness to keep peace. When connection loses reciprocity, you don't escalate, you withdraw with clarity. This makes your departures feel sudden to others, but to you they've been unfolding quietly for a long time. You might reflect on how often you were accused of changing. You didn't defend yourself. You knew the truth. You were responding to a new phase, not abandoning an old one impulsively. The accusation came from those still invested in continuity at any cost. You were invested in coherence, even when it cost you familiarity. Living as the threshold also trained your humility. You don't mistake transition for superiority. You know that cycles serve a purpose before they expire. You respect what came before without letting it dictate what comes next. This balance keeps you grounded. You're not destroying structures, you're acknowledging their limits. As this phase deepens, you feel a steady confidence replacing earlier frustration. You no longer wonder why you don't fit neatly. You understand now that fitting neatly would have disabled your function. You were meant to feel edges, to notice misalignment early, to stand where movement is required but language hasn't caught up yet. This is why you often feel called during moments of uncertainty, career pivots, relational shifts, identity crises, cultural transitions. You don't arrive with answers. You arrive with orientation. You help others sense when something has ended, even if they can't yet name what's beginning. The narrative moves forward by sharpening this insight. The lost Zodiac isn't missing from the wheel by accident. It's absent by necessity, so it can see the wheel clearly. The next part will show how standing outside the cycle didn't distance you from life. It positioned you to guide movement when the cycle stalls. Positioning yourself outside the cycle didn't remove you from life. It placed you closer to its mechanic. You see how momentum builds, how it decays, how it disguises exhaustion as stability. Where others experience continuity as comfort, you experience it as data. You notice when energy stops circulating and starts recycling itself. That's when you know a phase has ended, even if the surface still looks intact. You may recognize how this has shaped your instincts around timing. You don't rush beginnings, and you don't postpone endings. You sense the precise moment when staying becomes avoidance rather than commitment. This sensitivity isn't emotional volatility. It's pattern recognition refined through repeated exposure to transitions others ignored until consequences forced attention. The 13th zodiac exists in that narrow window, after belief fades but before collapse announces itself. You've lived there so often that uncertainty feels navigable to you. You don't romanticize it. You work inside it. You gather information, test footing, and wait for coherence to return before moving decisively. This patience keeps you from attaching to false clarity. You might reflect on how people come to you during these moments. Not to be told what to do, but to feel less alone while not knowing. You don't soothe with promises. You don't escalate fear. You normalize the in-between. That alone steadies people more than answers ever could. You offer presence that doesn't rush resolution. Standing outside the cycle also protected you from identity foreclosure. You didn't lock yourself into a version of yourself too early. You allowed evolution to continue even when it disrupted narratives others had about you. This made your life harder to explain, but easier to live honestly. You didn't have to unlearn a self that no longer fit. You may notice how this orientation keeps you adaptable without becoming reactive. When conditions change, you don't panic. You reassess. You look for leverage points rather than grand gestures. You move incrementally, preserving optionality. This is not indecision. It's strategy shaped by respect for complexity. As this settles, a quiet responsibility emerges. Not to lead people through cycles, but to signal when cycles have completed their function. You don't force movement. You make stagnation visible by refusing to pretend it's growth. This stance can feel lonely at times, but it preserves truth without aggression. The lost zodiac doesn't seek recognition. It seeks accuracy. You've always chosen accuracy even when it delayed belonging. That choice trained you to stand steady when others feel disoriented. It also trained you to step aside when others need to complete their own transitions. The story continues by narrowing further, toward what happens after you signal an ending. How you help movement begin without prescribing its direction. How you remain present without controlling outcomes. That movement comes next. After an ending is signaled, something delicate follows. Space. Most people rush to fill it. You don't. You understand that space is not absence. It's incubation. When an old cycle loosens its grip, meaning needs room to reorganize before a new form can hold. You protect that room instinctively, even when others grow uncomfortable. You may notice how this changes your role in moments of transition. You don't become the architect of the next phase. You become the guardian of openness. You slow conversations just enough to prevent premature certainty. You ask questions that don't demand answers yet. This restraint keeps new beginnings from inheriting old distortions. The 13th zodiac doesn't create the next order. It ensures the next order isn't born exhausted. You've always sensed this, that beginnings rushed under pressure carry the decay of what they replaced. You resist that transfer quietly. You wait until curiosity returns, until energy feels fresh rather than reactive. Then movement becomes possible. You might reflect on how often you've stepped back right when others expected you to lead forward. They mistook your pause for withdrawal. In truth, you were listening for readiness. You knew that direction chosen too early becomes another cycle to escape later. Timing mattered more than momentum. This orientation shaped your ethic. You don't manipulate uncertainty to gain influence. You don't leverage confusion to position yourself. You remain present without claiming ownership of outcomes. This keeps your involvement clean. People may not always recognize the value of this immediately, but they feel its effect when what emerges doesn't collapse. You may notice how this patience extends to your own life. You don't rush reinvention. You let identity reform naturally after endings. You allow grief, relief, and curiosity to coexist without forcing narrative. This prevents you from attaching to a future that hasn't matured yet. You move when alignment returns, not when fear demands resolution. As this phase settles, your confidence takes on a quieter form. You trust emergence. You trust that coherence will reappear if space is honored. This trust isn't naive. It's earned through repeated observation. You've seen what happens when space is respected. You've also seen what happens when it's violated. The lost Zodiac's function becomes clearer here. It doesn't rule time, it resets it. It marks the pause that allows systems to breathe before continuing. Without this pause, cycles accelerate until they break. You've been living as that pause, often misunderstood, rarely celebrated, but essential. The narrative tightens again. We're moving toward consolidation now. What you do after space has done its work. How you recognize when the new phase is ready to be entered without dragging the old one along. That recognition is subtle, and you know it well. Recognition arrives quietly, the way balance returns to a body after dizziness passes. You feel it before you name it. A subtle shift from suspension to readiness. The space you protected begins to organize itself, not through force, but through coherence. Signals align. Curiosity replaces anxiety. Movement becomes possible without urgency. You've learned to trust this moment. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's clean. There's no scramble to justify direction, no need to convince yourself or others. The new phase doesn't demand belief. It invites participation. You step forward not as a leader pulling others along, but as someone who knows the ground will hold. This is where your role becomes most misunderstood and most effective. People assume guidance means instruction. For you, it means orientation. You don't dictate outcomes. You help others sense where momentum naturally wants to go. You point to conditions rather than conclusions. This preserves agency and prevents dependency. What begins here has a chance to last. You may notice how this approach filters who moves with you. Those seeking certainty fall away. Those willing to stay attentive draw closer. This isn't exclusion, it's alignment. The lost Zodiac doesn't gather followers. It gathers readiness, and readiness can't be faked for long. Your comfort with transition gives others permission to slow down without shame. You normalize not knowing. You legitimize waiting. In a culture addicted to immediacy, this restraint feels radical. Yet it's precisely what keeps new cycles from inheriting the exhaustion of old ones. You've seen the cost of skipping this step. You refuse to repeat it. You might reflect on how this affects your sense of belonging. It's no longer tied to groups or labels. It's tied to timing. You feel most at home when movement is honest, when change isn't forced, and continuity isn't denied. That's when your presence feels effortless, almost invisible, and that invisibility is a sign of correct placement. As readiness consolidates, your internal tension dissolves further. You're no longer bracing against misfit. You're no longer compensating for being early. You're exactly where your function makes sense. Not celebrated, not opposed, used accurately. That accuracy restores energy you didn't know you were spending. The lost 13th Zodiac reveals its final discipline here, knowing when to enter without claiming ownership. You don't attach your identity to the new cycle. You don't need it to validate you. You participate fully, then release control. This keeps the system flexible. It also keeps you free. The narrative narrows again. What remains is not theory, but practice over time. How you sustain alignment once motion resumes. How you prevent the new cycle from hardening into the next stagnation. How you remain attentive without becoming rigid. One movement remains before closure. Not a revelation, a settling. Settling doesn't mean slowing down. It means weight finding its balance. Once motion resumes, you watch carefully, not for speed, but for strain. You know that new cycles fail not at the start, but when early success masks subtle misalignment. This is where your attention becomes most valuable. You don't interfere. You tune. You notice small signals others overlook. Where enthusiasm outruns structure. Where language begins to harden into slogans. Where flexibility quietly narrows. These are not crises. They are indicators. You respond with proportion, adjusting cadence, reintroducing questions, reopening space without disrupting progress. This keeps movement alive rather than locked. You may feel how different this is from control. Control clamps down. Tuning listens. You're not trying to preserve purity, you're preserving adaptability. The lost zodiac doesn't guard outcomes. It guards the ability to change before change becomes force. This is why your presence feels stabilizing without being restrictive. You might reflect on how often you step back right after things begin to work. Others interpret this as disinterest. In truth, it's confidence. You know that systems need room to prove themselves without constant correction. You stay near enough to sense drift, far enough to avoid dependence. That distance keeps both you and the system healthy. This phase refines your restraint further. You speak less, but your timing sharpens. When you intervene, it's early enough to be gentle and late enough to be accurate. You don't rescue. You recalibrate. This preserves dignity, for you and for those involved. Nothing collapses. Nothing crystallizes too soon. As settling continues, your internal tension fades almost completely. You're no longer anticipating misfit or bracing for correction. You trust your capacity to respond when needed. This trust frees attention for living rather than monitoring. You enjoy movement without gripping it. You allow success without trying to own it. The 13th zodiac, at this point, becomes nearly invisible. Its work is subtle by design. When it functions well, no one notices a disruption because none occurs. Transitions feel natural. Progress feels earned. Stability feels flexible. That's the mark of accurate settling. You sense that closure is near, not because something ends, but because explanation has done enough. What remains is repetition of a different kind. Not looping, but renewal through adjustment. You are fluent here. You don't need to name it anymore. One final movement remains. Not to add meaning, but to let meaning stand without support. What remains doesn't feel like identity. It feels like orientation. You no longer need the idea of the lost 13th zodiac to understand yourself. The symbol did its work. It gave language to a pattern you were already living. Now the language can fall away without taking the pattern with it. You move through life with a different relationship to cycles. You don't cling to beginnings, and you don't mourn endings the way others do. You respect both, but you don't confuse them with meaning itself. Meaning, for you, lives in responsiveness, in the ability to sense when continuation serves growth and when it merely repeats comfort. You understand now why you were never meant to be fully captured by a single archetype. Fixed identities decay. They resist revision. You were shaped to remain revisable without becoming unstable. That balance, fluid without being lost, is rare. It allows you to stay honest as conditions change without abandoning coherence. You may notice how little explanation you need now. You don't justify transitions. You don't defend pauses. You don't argue with those who prefer the certainty of closed systems. You simply move when alignment calls and stay still when it doesn't. This quiet authority doesn't demand agreement. It survives without it. The lost Zodiac was never missing from the wheel by accident. It exists so the wheel doesn't become a prison. It reminds motion when to stop and stillness when to release. You carry that function naturally, not as a role you perform, but as a way you remain attentive to reality rather than habit. As the story closes, nothing dramatic happens. There's no final unveiling, no elevation, no declaration of destiny. There is only clarity, clean, grounded, usable, the kind that lets you wake up, step into the day, and respond accurately to what's in front of you without dragging old cycles along. You don't feel finished. You feel available. Available to adjust. Available to let go. Available to begin again without repeating yourself. That availability is the real gift of the 13th place, not belonging to the cycle, but keeping it alive by refusing to let it harden. The story ends here because it no longer needs to continue. What it described is already in motion, and it will keep moving, quietly, accurately, without needing to be named again.